Hi, everyone. How are you doing? We're back today for our last content session for AP Geo and getting ready for the exam. Let me share my screen with you and we're going to get started. And of course, here we go. Hope everyone's having a good day. We've had quite a bit of weather that's working on it down here, so at least it changes up the atmosphere a little bit. Okay, so today, once again, I'm Ann Lindsley from Bel Air High School here in Houston, Texas. And as I said, today is our last of our kind of content sections, and then we're going to start talking about the FRQs and more about the logistics of writing those. But let's start with, first of all, if you want to send in a question, I have my trusty assistant here, and he will be monitoring any questions you have. Do ask serious questions. We get a lot of questions, and we want to make sure we can answer some of them, answer the questions at least that are definitely about the exam. So all the chit chat stuff, save that for some other place, some other area, because it clouds up his questions. And so we want to make sure we don't miss anyone. So anyway, there's the login number for the Slido link if you want to do that. So yesterday, you all had this FRQ from Miss Brandt, and I would like to go over it and talk about what you're looking at in terms of this political area topic that has to also overlap with scale and voting districts and population numbers, how we interpret some of this. So get out your answers if you wrote them down. Otherwise, think about what you wrote down. So in this first question here, you're asked to identify one difference in the scale of analysis among the districts shown on the map. So here we have scale of analysis. So how am I going to figure this one out? So first of all, and I'm going to start saying this every single day, you have to read everything that is a visual on this visual stimulus, everything. Before you start pulling apart the middle, I want you to read everything around the edges. So those of you who've been trained on the FR or the DBQ process, you were trained on that, used to do that years ago to train people, everything around the edges first. What is the source of the information? What is in the legend? What is the legend measuring? What is the title? What is the date? Where is my mouse? What is being asked for? Then start looking at the data. Look at the measurements of the data. Everything that is on this graph, these graphs is what you want to look at. So I need my mouse to appear. Let me go forward and come back. It's not appearing. That's not good. All right, anyway, so in this first question, I want to identify one difference in the scale of analysis among the districts that are shown. And so what I'm going to do is that I have on my graph here, I have at large, New York, Delaware at large, Virginia, Texas, Colorado. And that was Wyoming at large, sorry. So, and I see the same thing in the population 2017 as I see in the area and population density. So what is one difference in the scale of these measurements that are being shown here? Anyone guess? This says at large. That says at large for Delaware. New York, Virginia, and Texas all are representing specific districts in those states. So there's our first element of scale of analysis. We're either talking about the entire state or we're talking about a specific district. Where that specific district is, it doesn't really matter for this particular question. It's telling you it's in this state, whereas this is telling you the entire state is at large. So there's one district in that concept, okay? So we have to consider scale of analysis is looking at the size of the data that's being represented. So are we looking at population? Are we looking at boundaries? How are we looking at this in relation to the next larger element, the next larger scale, okay? Or the next smaller scale, you can go either way. All right, using the data shown in the graphs, identify one urban district. Well, there's no cities listed, right? There's no cities listed. I'm freaking out. There's not a city that I recognize, right? Calm down. Look at this. This says area and population density. Now, you know from the urban section, you also know from the population section that cities have a higher degree of population density, a demographic factor. So if I know that cities have a higher degree of density, then maybe I can deduce that the New York 13th district and the 8th district of Virginia, those must be in cities. Do I need to know what cities they are? No, it's not asking you that. It's asking you which district might be representative of a city. And the way I deduce that is by the population density. Okay, I hope that works for everyone. So part C, using the data shown in the graphs, explain how the relationship between area and population density affects the size of the districts. So keep in mind, district boundaries are drawn with the goal that each district will have approximately the same size population. Now, how would I know that? In Unit 1, where we talked about mapping data and looking at scale of analysis of different types of data and different locations of similar types of data, one of those elements of scale is the census. And the purpose of the census tract is to divide the population up in fairly equal sized numbers. Okay, this is part of the whole point of the census to begin with. Yeah, I mean, that is to count the population. But so we divide the population up into these areas, these tracts, and then those tracts are used for delegates to Congress, congressional delegates. So this is why, you know, if you want to talk about today's topic, which has to do with cause and effect, this is why making sure the census get filled out is important. That way your person yourself is represented because the census was done, you're in that census tract, and now that census tract is going to have a congressional representative for the numbers of people in that tract. Okay, so in this particular, on the relationship between population density affects the size of districts, it is directly having to do with the amount of districts you're going to have in a particular city or in a particular state based upon the equal distribution of the population. Okay, describe one way in which the process of redistricting manipulated for political gain. Oh, raise your hand if you know the answer. Everyone, you wrote down gerrymandering, right? Perfect. Give yourself a pat on the back. Gerrymandering is a factor that deals with how we redistrict or how we reproportion districts so that political parties that implement the redistricting can remain in power, so as to concentrate political power, perhaps in the hands of different constituents. But that's how redistricting can be manipulated. Okay. All right. So the last question, explain one challenge a representative might face in connecting with rural constituents as compared to urban constituents. So people who live in the rural side versus in the urban areas. And we see this in a lot of states where you have like some major cities and then you have lots of rural population or smaller city populations. So people who live in the rural areas may feel like the city runs everything, or that whatever the city votes for is the way it goes. We have that here in Texas, Houston, Dallas. It's almost like Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, all gang up against the rest of the state. You have the same thing. Whatever way Chicago votes goes the way of Illinois. New York City, same thing. Whatever way New York City goes, that's the way the state goes. California has the same. So when you have these large urban areas and you have smaller populations in rural areas, sometimes the folks in the rural areas feel like they are left out because the interest of the city becomes more prevalent because they're able to get more of their position elected to government. The other thing also is that people who live in rural areas may not have a high degree of connectivity in terms of high-speed internet, even television services at times in a lot of rural areas can be poor performing. So they don't have that immediate access to a representative that you may have in the city where the office may be located, for one. And then rural constituents, a lot of times you'll hear them say that Washington, D.C. is out of touch with their issues because of the not being in the city. The distance issue comes into play here. So So there's a disconnect, really, is what is a major challenge for people in the more rural areas versus the urban areas. And you know what? The United States is not alone. You have the same thing in other countries. All right, so I hope you got those answers down. And if you have any questions, send them in. Make sure that I didn't already explain it. All right, so one more time. Oh my gosh, May 12th is coming soon, y'all. Y'all getting ready, getting excited? We got another week and a few days here. So once again, you're going to question one is going to be 25 minutes. And free response question, you're going to have 2 different pieces of stimuli on it. So maps, charts, data, 2 different pieces, images could be in there too. Okay, one more time, because I received 2 questions from students about this. Yes, units 1 through 5 are the focus, but just like this particular question that we just went through on political, it referenced an urban district. This is not an urban question. This is a political question, but it required that you had some sort of a conceptual nature about the urban area, okay? So be careful with that. This is the reason, one of the 2 reasons why College Board had us complete units 6 and 7, so that everyone would have an overview of urban and an overview of development, because it trickles back all the way through this entire course. You want to think of everything as threads that are all wrapped together or woven together. So question number 2 is going to be shorter. So that's going to be 15 minutes to read and respond. So this is going to have to be done quick. And we're going to be practicing this in the next week. Here you'll have 1 piece of data to work with. And once again, units 1 through 5. Once again, just like we've said many times, describe and explain, compare and contrast are the verbs that we're using with to apply examples, to apply geographic concepts, okay? So this apply geographic concepts is not a task verb. This is a method for which you are describing and explaining your answer, okay? Or analyzing patterns by giving examples from what you are looking at. And you're going to have to do that. You're going to have to talk about the stimuli that you're looking at. So, all right, so today's topic is looking at big idea number 2, which in this particular topic, it's asking you to look at impacts and interactions. Basically, what we're looking at is the relationships that are caused from cause and effect conditions that exist among people, the environment, the past or present, and the future. So what is the relationship of cause and effect? What is the relationship to particular topics in the curriculum that cause certain things, and then the responses from others? You want to keep in mind, and I've said this a couple of times when we were talking about what are the big ideas, what are the skills, what are different themes. So big ideas serve as a foundation of the course, and it enables students to create meaningful connections among the course concepts. So we're connecting from unit to unit to unit. And that's why you can't think of this as chapter 1 or chapter 10 in the textbook. This is the unit, and the unit serves as a foundation for building more information and more connections for the next unit and for the next unit. So this is the time of the year that I normally have said to my students for the last 20, almost 30 years, because I teach another course too, where I've said, when we get to March, there's going to be this light bulb, and you're going to have an epiphany. And what it is you are going to start that all of this stuff that we've been doing since August is now all interconnected. And you should have been seeing that the way that Ms. Brandt and I have been going through stuff, constantly trying to show you those connections. And I know your teachers did too, but it's super hard, particularly for first-year teachers, first-time students around in this. It is super hard to just say, okay, I'll get this when it gets to March, but right now I don't know what I'm getting. But you should be seeing how all of this overlaps with itself, okay? All right, and that's what we're going to be talking about a lot more in the next couple of days. Particularly pay attention to the FRQ questions, because that's showing you that. So keep in mind our task verbs, and we're going to deal with these more in the next couple of days. Describe, explain, and compare, okay? So what are we looking at when we start to look at relationships of cause and effect? Well, for example, in Unit 1, we're looking at how maps show us complex relationships. Well, what does that show me? That shows me the physical United States, the physical features in the North American continent and this area by borders becomes the United States. Yeah, okay, well, I've got some physical features there. So if I look at a political map, okay, now I don't have any physical features except for rivers, but then I'm looking at political, I'm getting a different set of data. I'm looking at a lot of geometric boundaries. I'm looking at a lot of natural boundaries. I'm looking at, okay, names, toponymy. But then I look at a different map of the same place. And now I start to see different patterns. And I've shown you this map before. So I'm looking at different patterns that are connecting to different places. And I can do different also with a different piece of data that's not even barely on the ground. The big dots are on the ground. It's a flight map of basically North America, but can you see the United States? You make out the Boston, Washington, megalopolis in here, Seattle, Portland over here, LA, San Francisco, LA is San Francisco, you know, Dallas, Houston would be down here. So anyway, you can, Atlanta, Hartsfield, you start to be able to pick out places. We're looking at connections here, but what are we doing? We need to start seeing how all of this overlaps. And one of the things that I think is always interesting is if you continue to look at this area here, that we know we go back to the physical map and we see what is in here. And so we start to see what is missing. And what is missing in this region is the result of our physical landscape. And this is why we have to continue thinking about what was there, what is that relationship? Why is something not there? Let's look at another example of this. In this unit, we're also looking at maps, how, in addition to how they show us relationships creating cause and effect, we're also looking at how data influences things. And we're trying to understand how population movement is important. And we begin to look at concentrations. Well, this is an interesting map. This is actually a map of something that is very active today. This is a map of why we're doing this way. This is a map of why you are not in your classroom with your teacher doing all kinds of fun little things to get ready for the exam. This is a COVID-19 map. And you can pick out the hot spots. It is a heat thermal map, but it is showing your COVID-19 areas. Okay, so hopefully you also watched or you've heard about this already. If you haven't, make sure you Google this. From CBS News. On Sunday night was the 60-minute segment where the scientist who heads up the Blue Dot Corporation in Canada was explaining his algorithm for incorporating data, geographic data, artificial intelligence, tracking people's movements in order to be able to predict. Predicting from data is part of this topic of contemporary understanding of how we can have an effect. So if we look at this scary map from February 13th, we see the movement of the population to areas that are beginning to have, where COVID was beginning to spread on February 13th. Then we start to see on March 12th, hotspots emerging. Last night, we look at the data as it's appearing and showing us the awful statistics associated with this. But ultimately, this is a map of data. It is showing us the causal factor is the virus. The effect is where it's going to happen, but it's showing the relationship of where this data is going to essentially explode, which is the virus. And I thought his comment, understanding population movement, is so important to understanding how a virus spreads. This is the unity of biology and geography. This is so beautiful. You should take that to your biology teachers and let them know that geography is much, much more important. Anyway, what he is predicting from this is the continual spread to where they might come up with a vaccine and all those predictions, which are scary to listen to. So in this particular aspect, we want to look at what is the effect. Why did they do this? Why did they do this data collection? So they could predict. So they could predict where we need to have hospital operations going, where we need to have more supplies sent in, so they could watch the spread. All right, so in the population unit, we begin to see a little bit different topics that are related to impact. You know, one of the biggest ones, okay, doubling time. Everyone memorizes the doubling time. Everyone memorizes the population, 7.7 billion people in 2019. What's the effect of that? You have the cause, all those people, but what's the effect of it? And that's what we fail to talk about through some of this stuff. And I want you to pay attention to that. What is the effect of increase in the population? Well, we got to look at the data in a different way. If we are going to look at population doubling time, don't we want to see where it's at? And that's what we see. Where in the world do we have the fastest doubling time? Where do we have the slowest doubling time? And for those of you who should be looking at this map and go, there's a north-south division. There is a division here between the developed worlds and the less developed worlds. There is a difference here between what is in the tropics and what is in the subtropics and the upper mid latitudes. You know, there's something going on. Why is the population in the tropics have a higher doubling time? Meaning faster doubling time. Okay. All right. So we want to look at that. Well, all right. So we also want to look for causes and effects in terms of the data that we look at in the population unit. So what is the effect of population growth? Anyone ever thought about, well, if the population continues to grow, what's going to happen? Well, what happens when development starts to play a role? What happens when you start having migration to cities? What happens when development spawns manufacturing and service sectors and you move into a global economy? Well, that changes your human development index. And that's exactly what you're looking through here. If you've ever played with Gapminder, if you haven't, here's a new fun toy, better than a video game. But Gapminder is really cool because you get to change your variables here. Well, I wanted you to look at population growth. How does population growth change over time? And then how does the human development index change with population growth? And if we look at this here in 2014, we see an interesting trend line coming straight down. It's a wide trend line. And then notice that the United States is just a little bit above what would be the middle of that trend line. But keep in mind, we have to ask, well, why is that? The United States actually falls fairly high with human development. It does. But we also have a higher birth rate than the other countries that are in the same area of HDI. Well, why does the United States have a higher population growth rate? For one, we have a little bit higher birth rate. And for two, we also have a higher migration rate. And so population growth this isn't natural. This is a birth rate minus death rate plus migration. So you have that migration factor coming in. So the US is a country with a lot of, the US is a country with a lot of immigrants, but yet we still have this high population rate, as well as a really high development status if we were to look at it any other way. So a question just came up really quite appropriate to this. What about the rule of 70? Rule of 70 is not in our curriculum. That rule of 70, I think it should be, but it's not. So that's obviously somebody from biology or from AP Environmental, because in AP Environmental, we have to teach the rule of 70 and how to do the math. But yes, the rule of 70 would apply here to the doubling time, but we don't have to do that calculation. We need to know, what is the effect of a quick doubling time? If you have a short doubling time, what does that mean for your country? What does that mean for development? Why would you have a short doubling time? That means you're having a lot of babies. So what is going on in the population or in the culture that for some reason they're having a disproportionate number of babies? All right. If we take that information and then we look at our favorite, the demographic transition model, we can then also take all of this data and correlate it to development. And so we're looking at, okay, well, our birth rates are leveling off, our death rates are decreasing, but our population is increasing. Why is that happening? What is that linked to? Well, the link is development. So development is happening. People are migrating to cities as your development level is increasing here in stage 2. we have this high birth rate, but our death rate is decreasing. Why is our death rate decreasing? Because people have access to clean water. People have access to better foods. I'm not talking about going out for dinner and that kind of stuff. Something better than just gruel, you know, proteins, a variety of your diet. Access to safe water is a big factor. What happens is fewer people are dying. Fewer people are dying. Your birth rates are remaining fairly constant here in stage 2. Your population is going to continue to grow because there's more people being counted at that one time. But then what causes things to change? As you move into stage 3, what happens here is, why all of a sudden are they having fewer children? Because you've had a high degree of migration, you have a high degree of security of knowledge that your children are going to make it to adulthood. Children are expensive. You want to be able to give more to the ones you have. All these kind of variables come in as the cause for the reducing the number of children one is having. Education of females is a big factor. So waiting later in life to have the first child, that's another factor. So, but what's continued to happen is that we have fewer people dying. So fewer people dying, fewer babies even being born, we still have a population increase. So this is all triggered by development. What does development cause? In the population unit, development causes this. Development causes stage 3. More development causes us to move to stage 4. Okay? More development causes us to move to stage 4. Okay? So, and that's actually right down here at the very bottom on this particular diagram. The effects, the cause and the effects. All right, well, let's move on. And I showed you this diagram the other day as well. How does this play out in other countries? We can see the same factors playing out in the other countries in terms of their population rates increasing as their birth and death rates are also starting to level off. All right, now the flip side of that, we always have to know both sides of the story. It goes back to Malthus, and I know all of you have had Malthus really, really well, because once again, you also have Malthus in biology and in environmental science. But what was Malthus doing? Well, he was looking at as a political economist during the age of the Enlightenment. He was looking at the state of conditions at the time. And, you know, European powers were having to import food. There was a threat of death and famines. Climate conditions were unfavorable due to a mini ice age period of time that caused severe degradation in places and people not able to get the yields out of farms that they were intending to. Cities had a lack of knowledge about hygiene and fresh water and where to do with waste. And the only way to explain poverty and death and famine, he wrote about in his famous essay that maybe some of you got to read. I'm sorry, but no, it's actually good. The essay on the principle of population was that population is going to grow much faster than food production, and the growth left unchecked in the end, the growth in the end is checked by famine, disease, and war at the point where we don't have enough resources to take care of the population. So this J curve, or this increase, this exponential increase in population here, is resolved by disease, famine, or war. As I tell my environmental class, Mother Nature has a cure for everything. Anyway, but Malthus's position was the concern of agriculture and countries in terms of looking at their demographics until the second agricultural revolution, then followed by the Green Revolution, and now the third revolution, where we're making vegetables inside of former warehouses with artificial light in downtown New York City. And also growing vegetables in a hothouse at McMurdo Station in Antarctica. So we have, what Malthus didn't take into consideration is technology. So we had causes and we had an effect at that time, but then changes to that effect. All right, migration. In this unit on migration, we also have a cause and effect relationship between that we can see with the data in terms of looking at the causes of migration, your push and pull factors, looking at the effect of migration, both on the country that receives the migrant population and then on the countries that are losing that migrant population. You know, there's a couple of countries that accuse the United States of heavy brain drain. that we are pulling their people to the United States for school and for jobs, and that's causing, as I said, a brain drain in their country, and they want to encourage those young people to stay in their country. But then we look at it at a regional scale, we begin to see immigration a little bit differently. We see the global scale at the top map, but when we look at the others, we're looking at these routes. We are looking at more of a regional scale of where is this population going to? Why are they going where they are? And um, what is the reason for their push out of their country? What's pulling them into theirs? And one of the things you start to see is that, particularly from Africa to portions of Europe, you see people that are being pulled to their former colonial power because that relationship was set up, for one, but others because they have declining demographics in terms of a higher old age dependency, so they don't have enough workers at the younger age for industrial and agricultural jobs. So they're pulling people in because those jobs, the perception those jobs are available. You have other conflicts. Look at this in Southeast Asia, these migration flows in Southeast Asia. You're looking at here issues that have to do with war, issues that have to do with jobs, working in Indonesia in the oil and gas industry, but also working in textile industries, pulling people in. All right, let's go on. In the culture unit, we also have factors of diffusion, which we look at in terms of contributing to a cause and effect relationship. We begin to have populations migrating out of areas of the traditional Fertile Crescent, the 11th, the areas where some of our religious hearths are going to be. And as those populations start to migrate for whatever reasons, trade routes, farming, war, they're going to take their religion with them. And so when they take their religion with them, don't they have an impact on where they go? Are they not building religious facilities? Are they not having group discussions? They are imprinting a footprint on their new landscape. And that's what you need to realize with diffusion, is that as things move to different places, they alter that cultural landscape. So we see that with religion. We can see that particularly in the New World. Think about all of the period of exploration and colonialism, and how religion was brought to North America and also into South America. What religion was brought and how has that impacted on our landscape? You can see, do you have churches? Do you have mosques? A new immigration with the newer immigration with seeing the mosques on the landscape. What kind of Christian churches are they? Are they cathedrals? Are they Protestant Christian? So you begin to see that in this part of the world, and then you also see the others in the other types of the Buddhist. We have Buddhist shrines. We have everything here in the Houston area because we're such a mix of the global landscape. And so you can go and see the Indian shrines or the Hindu shrines, and you can see the Buddhist shrines and the Catholic Archdiocese. And so anyway, it's pretty cool. But what I want you to see is that diffusion changes that cultural landscape. So does language. So our languages, they are thought to begin to move out of their original hearths, their original origins, as populations started to move because changing agriculture. No longer were they hunters and gatherers. They're now going to be sedentary farmers. And so they have to move to areas where they can actually farm. And they take their language with them. And then over time, that language is isolated from other speakers. It's going to change in formation, and it begins the foundations for our world languages that we then begin to have, that we have today. Think about all of those topics that you talked about, how language changes. It's isolated, it has dialectical differences, it has influence from new groups. How does all of that change? That changes, it has a cause to it, and then the effect is that change. In the political unit, we also see how the role of boundaries begin to cause change. How do they change relationships? How do they affect political relationships, particularly over time? And so you looked at several issues that dealt with political topics, different types of borders, devolutionary factors, territorial factors. But then if you have to look at them through the lens of how does this cause an effect, or what effect does this have? So if we look at a couple of borders here, this is the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And along this border, you actually have conflict between ethnic populations. So now we have a superimposed boundary where one of those countries has been at war for over 20 years, over 30 years. And these boundaries are creating this conflict themselves that is affecting the populations that live there. They either have to move away, so many of them die in conflict. You have a similar concept here in the region of Jammu Kashmir between Pakistan and India. And I believe Ms. Brandt showed you an image of what it looks like from the Pakistan side and then what it looks like from the Indian side. Regardless, this area of territorial dispute, the effect of that is that there is a higher degree of security in this region. This is a hot spot for terrorist activities and other challenges between both Pakistan and India created by that boundary. I wanted to kind of look at some different boundaries to remind you of some conflicts. And one of those is in Iraq. And your conflict here between Sunni and Shia Muslim, but then also throw the Kurds in as well as a stateless nation. And you have internal boundaries that are in conflict because of how those boundaries were essentially created post World War I. And so those are a superimposed boundary causing a devolutionary factor, a potential devolutionary factor in this area. And then we talked about this the other day, the issue of the Crimea being taken again by Russia, because a large portion of this population is Russian, but ultimately because they wanted the port of Sevastopol to maintain as a military port on the Black Sea. All right, so other boundaries that I think sometimes we don't pay attention to as well. We need to. These are your maritime boundaries, and you should have gone through UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas and Maritime Boundaries. But we have conflicts as a result of those maritime boundaries. And those conflicts, the boundaries are the cause, the effect is the conflict. So in this particular one off the coast of Australia and East Timor, there's oil fields. And East Timor, through negotiations, has managed to be able to have 90% of the control of that oil field. And Australia has 10%. And the oil field sits on the midline. And this is the problem between when you have close overlapping maritime boundaries, is who controls those natural resources. The Caribbean is the same mess. You have overlapping jurisdictions. You have, well, they're not overlapping, they split. And so you have some areas with the very close proximity to other countries with different types of laws. And one of these in particular, some of this conflict comes with those that are British, follow British laws, British maritime laws, and that creates some conflicts in the areas. But these maritime boundaries are always a problem in the Caribbean, particularly for people navigating between the islands. And then, of course, my favorite is the Arctic and what's going to happen with the Arctic. What's going to happen as the Arctic sea ice continues to melt? As that continues to melt, we're opening up a whole nother set of effects. What is the cause? The cause is sea ice is melting. You can get into all the causes for the sea ice melting, but here is the sea ice is melting. So it's opening up this whole other channel for economic, social, political, and environmental use, abuse, conflict, however you want to be able to begin to interpret it. In the political unit, the types of governments we have leads to possible good effects and bad effects. Keep in mind, if you're a unitary government, in a unitary state, most of the political power is in the hands of a central government. And that works great if you don't have much cultural or ethnic diversity. You have very strong cultural and national unity. But if you don't, you are going to disenfranchise some of those populations that don't necessarily identify with that centralized government, and that becomes a problem. Whereas in a federal state, like the United States, nations have greater diversity, and so you have a distribution of powers down to regional, down to state levels, and then county levels and city levels, official boundaries. And then even within cities, you have different jurisdictions. Besides county, like we have hospital districts and we have community college districts and school districts. Those are all different types of taxing jurisdictions that have rights within those areas. So that's all part of the concept of federal governments distributing power all the way down. So those all have different types of effects on your population and your distribution of the population as well. In the agricultural unit, we start to look at how do our agricultural practices have consequences in our global use of the land for food production. We see that not only are we using what little land we have, of the 29% of our land that we do have, 29% is all we've got. And then 71% of that is habitable. And of that 71%, 50% of it is used for agriculture. And then it starts being partitioned down and down depending upon what type of agriculture we're using. So we're using an awful lot of land to feed our population, and that's going to have consequences. And those consequences are most observed in the types of activities that then impact the environment. So our effects on the environment, the increase in greenhouse gases, the increased amount of land that is used, the contamination of fresh water causing eutrophication. Go ask your environmental science teacher for that. You don't need to know eutrophication, but some of you may know it. And then that's water pollution caused by algae growth. And then biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity. Over 24,000 species have been lost because of just agricultural practices. So food is at the heart of trying to tackle climate change, reducing water stress, pollution, restoring lands, blah, blah, blah. The production of food is our cause. And what is our effect? And I need to give examples, okay? I've lost fresh water, I've lost land, I create greenhouse gases for the production of foods. What are those I know somebody's asking, how is greenhouse gases affected by food production? Well, you have to, the creation of pesticides, the creation of using synthetic fertilizers, those are petrochemical products. So those have to be obtained, drilled, and then those are converted into synthetic products. You have to move agricultural products. A lot of times that's done by truck. People that go in and slash and burn, clear forested areas, that's releasing carbons into the atmosphere. So you are releasing carbons as you are upsetting the soils that have never been cultivated before. You're releasing more carbons. Growing the food in order to feed the livestock, and sheep and cows are the largest consumers of the grains that are produced. Those the sheep and the cows, not only is it the grain that's produced, but also the transportation and the manufacturing into the final products all contributes to the amount of greenhouse gases that are also provided or that are also caused. So then on top of that, we also have soil degradation. Those areas in the dark red are areas that we've pretty much already ruined the soils. There's no chance in trying to recover many of those soils without heavy use of irrigated soils or increasing your fertilizers. So that leads us to our challenges of contemporary agriculture. Our challenges today, that's an example of an algal growth or eutrophication actually would be going on in that. Do we obtain food from factory farms, or are we obtaining it from the family farm? Is it organic or not organic? Is it free range? Is it a niche type operation? You know, what is it that we are doing today in order to look at the effect on our environment, ease that effect on our environment, but yet still provide food for our growing population? And these challenges are only exacerbated by the problems of increased desertification, which is these yellow areas, or increasing areas of further desertification, and then also continued loss of biodiversity. All of this makes it more challenging to meet the needs of global food security. Where do we have the greatest insecurity of food? In your tropic region, in your in sub-Saharan Africa, in portions of South Asia. Our greatest food insecurity comes in these areas that have environmental challenges to begin with and huge population pressures. Okay, and we can look at this on a global scale. It really doesn't tell us. We know very well there are people that are hungry in the United States, and it makes it look like there isn't. But if we look at it in terms of the United States, yes, we do have people that are hungry. And actually, you really need to take this down to the state level of scale, even to the county level of scale. I think if you looked at the county level of scale in most of the places that you live, if you looked at the food deserts in those areas, you would be surprised what parts of town are absent from high quality foods within a mile of their location. And then do we look at that data? How does that data correlate to the rest of life? And that's what happens. We start to see large areas of obesity problems, large areas correlated to diabetes, large areas that are correlated then to not having access to quality food. And that is part of food insecurity as well. Okay, so ultimately, we are looking at climate changes, factors of climate change or climate actions that impact our agriculture. This is, as of last night, our drought meter. So where are we expecting it to be tough for growing crops in some of our areas? Looks like the Midwest might be sort of okay. But ultimately, we are looking at the contemporary issues of where we are in the future and how might climate change impact our agricultural yields. And that's important because we have to be able to still feed the world's population. Okay. All right. So if we were to check for understanding, we go back through all those topics again. Maps cause relationships. Data collection helps to show us those relationships. Demographic studies helps us to understand those relationships. Migration is a cause and effect relationship. We look at boundaries, how they cause complex relationships of cause and effect. We look at governments, how they can create cause and effect problems for people. Agricultural cause and effect situations on the environment and on contemporary actions of our land today. Ultimately, this whole topic is about relationships of cause and effect that impact and change the way people live and function in their place in the past, present, and the future. So what is causing the things that we see, which are the effects? And we have to look at them through the lens of our units of this course. Okay. The way we understand this course, the way that we understand all of these parts helps us to better understand the impact and then what we could do to improve it or make things better. So there's for the teachers, all the connections of this topic all the way through all the units. So AP question to practice, I know. I love this question, by the way. This was a question that I actually got to work with when it was live. And this, I want to point out some things about this question because of the issue that still keeps coming up about units 6 and 7. And I know I already addressed it, but I want to show you something in this. In this question here, well, you can read the prompt. Infant mortality varies widely around the world and is affected by complex real world characteristics. Infant mortality rate is a key demographic indicator used to assess social, economic, and other conditions at multiple geographic scales. Okay. So here I want you to identify predominant ranges of infant mortality. That's the population unit in South Asia and in Western Europe. So I'm looking at two regional scales. To scale of analysis is regional. Well, this Western Europe is a regional and South Asia is a regional scale of analysis too. Okay. Then I want you to describe two economic reasons. So I'm using my economic lens to look at infant mortality. Economic reasons for the level of infant mortality in Western Europe. Why does Western Europe have a low infant mortality? What is the cause and effect? Through an economic lens. Okay. Now, next is I want you to identify and explain. You have to do both. A specific way in which the following two UN Sustainable Development Goals are intended to affect infant mortality rates in rural communities in South Asia. Okay, so maybe you didn't read all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but hello, can we not figure this one out? Quality education. You should have had that also in the demographic section. Why do we want people to have an education? Why is it important to educate girls? So that there's a value there so that they can better take care of their families, so they can help to earn an income, so they can improve the quality of life. You had all that. You didn't have to wait to Unit 7 to get the Sustainable Development Goals. We already had that in Unit 2. And then clean water and sanitation is something that also goes along with development factors of population, once again, in Unit 2. And that also is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. Unit 7. So this is a beautiful question. It has threads through our entire course. We have several different layers of scale of analysis, okay? And anyway, it's a good question. See what you can come up with the answer, and Miss Brandt will talk about that tomorrow. And my trusty assistant has been monitoring your questions over here, so hopefully we can field some of those for what time is left. Trusty assistant. Are there going to be exam? We are going to start talking about the exam on Thursday. In fact, on Thursday, the chief reader is going to join us, and we're going to be answering some of those questions for your exam stuff. You should have received a ticket, or not a ticket, I'm sorry. You should have received an email from College Board, but regardless, you'll be logging into your College Board website to access your exam questions for all of your exams. Are there any summary sheets or lists of AP Human Geo definitions topics which you could use as a reference? You can use anything you want to. You can, okay, so any types of geo questions or anything like that. You can make and do whatever you want. Maybe your teachers have provided you with things. Maybe you've done little projects in class. You can have whatever you want to use, except for the internet, your mom, okay, and someone else. You have to do this, but the problem is you have a limited amount of time. So you really have to think about what you don't have time to be flipping through a book. So you really also don't need laundry lists of geographic terms. That's a lot of times the terms are defined for you, and you're just not going to need those, but you can use whatever materials you want. Could the FRQs on the exam yes. Could the FRQs on the exam combine more than one unit? Yes, that's been the whole we've been talking about since day one. Yes, the FRQs do. I just illustrated that with the question I gave you today. It covers unit 2, population. It covers the development concept that we find in unit 7 and in unit 2, regional aspects, which is part of unit 1. Yes, they do. What are some important historical events we should memorize for the exam? Okay, historical events. Geography is a current subject. It's today and now. We have a rule of thumb. Don't go back more than 50 years. 50 years is too long. Today, and stay with the present. It's so there. We don't give you a list of history events, but your teacher should have been using examples all year long that reference, and we've been using examples in all of these presentations. And you'll notice they're all current. Nothing is as old as I am. How can we tell the difference between a US map at the national scale versus a US map at the state scale? Now, a map of the US is a national scale. A map of the US is a national scale. A map of Texas, a map of Florida, a map of New York is the state scale. A map of Los Angeles, a map of Albany, New York, a map of Peoria, Illinois, Tallahassee, Florida. Those are at the city scale. A map I showed you the other day, my high school, the town inside of Houston where I am. That's the map of a town, that town at that scale. And then your place is at your spatial location, your individual. So a map of the United States is a map of the United States with all the stuff, all the data inside of it. A map of Texas or whatever state, Alaska, with all of the details of highways and counties and cities is at the Texas scale, or I'm sorry, the Alaska scale, sorry. Okay. And every time you keep going down smaller and smaller in the spatial extent of that map that you're looking at, you'll have more detail, lots more detail. What's the next one? Why did Germany dip so much in population growth in the early 2010s? It was actually, what they've done is actually grow since then. You have migration, heavy migration has come in from North Africa and the Middle East as a result of the wars in the Middle East, and then also issues in North Africa of migrants leaving. And so actually what's happened is they've had increased migration. What should I do if the FRQ asks to provide a real world example and I can't think of one? Go back and look at the prompt, look at the map, see if anything shakes your mind. A lot of times a real world example is an extra point. It's like the whole discussion is not totally dependent on that. Sometimes it is, but try your best. Maybe you'll think of something. Take a deep breath. The other thing in terms of preparing for it, you might want to do is use some have a list of the content topics throughout the course and write down some examples. Have those examples available to you. That maybe that list just rings a bell when you are writing it. What is next? Since the exam is open book, could we quote information? You don't have time for quoting anything. Don't do that. Just quoting it while you're not going to be writing the kinds of questions that you would need to quote something in. No, COVID-19 will not be on the test. The scale, could you also say the total population among the districts compared to how many people there are per square mile? Well, no, congressional districts are by population size. It's not dealing with density. It's how many people there are in that set census tract. Would Wyoming at large be a state scale and Virginia 8 be a regional? No, Virginia, the 8th district of Virginia is a is a congressional district in a city. Wyoming at large is a state scale. Yes. All right. I need to wrap everything up on this. And so I wish to wish you a good evening on everything and hope that you will join us back tomorrow and see Miss Brandt for the last topic that deals with models and theories. And sorry for the short blip, and hope you have a good evening. Bye.